Good morning. I'm Shay Frechette, co-owner of Frechette Winery and chair of the Regional Chambers Board of Directors. Thank you so much for attending the second session of the 2021 Tri-Cities Diversity Summit. When the first Tri-Cities Diversity Summit took place 4 years ago, the intent was to create open, meaningful dialogue about issues that affect businesses and residents in the region. And due to the COVID pandemic, we're presenting this event virtually for the second year. And although we're not gathering in person to have these conversations with each other, our hope is that everyone who watches the sessions this week will find opportunities to have open, meaningful dialogue within their workplace and their peer groups. This year's Tri-Cities Diversity Summit features 4 listening sessions, a keynote presentation, and the announcement of the 2021 Tri-Cities Champion of Diversity Award recipients. The next listening session is titled Critical Conversations. In this session, DEI experts from across the country are going to engage in critical conversations about what DEI work is and what accountability looks like when it relates to DEI. Before we turn to the panel, I'd like to thank Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, the premier sponsor of the Tri-Cities Diversity Summit. We greatly appreciate their partnership during the past 4 years as premier sponsor of this impactful event. Cadillac is a silver sponsor of the Tri-Cities Diversity Summit. Risa Khalil, president and CEO of Cadillac, has provided a message for today's attendees.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Cadillac is proud to sponsor the Diversity Summit and would like to thank the Chamber for creating space for this important dialogue. Cadillac opened its doors in 1944, and since that time, our workforce has grown to more than 3,700 committed caregivers who've come to the Tri-Cities from around the country and, in fact, all over the world. We value our diverse team and know that our differences strengthen us as an organization. Our mission is to provide safe, compassionate care to all patients who seek services at Cadillac. Our vision of health for a better world calls us to focus on improving access for the most vulnerable among us, and we are resolute in our commitment to strengthen our focus on health equity for our community. Thank you again to the Chamber for hosting this summit and to attendees for recognizing the importance of this ongoing conversation.
Thank you, Risa and Cadillac, for your silver level sponsorship of the Tri-Cities Diversity Summit. And now to this morning's listening session, Critical Conversations. Let's welcome our session moderator, Lynn Carlson. Lynn is the founder of Gemini Corp here in the Tri-Cities and has 23 years. Yes, you heard that right. 23 years of experience in DEI work. She is also a member of the My Tri 2030 Inclusion Council. Lynn, it is so great to see you here and to get to hear you moderate this panel. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Shay. I appreciate you. And I am joined today by some amazing DEI practitioners that I would love to have introduce themselves to the group. Again, my name is Lynn. My pronouns are she, her. I am coming to you from the traditional indigenous territories of the Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Yakima tribes. I would love to be able to give you an image description for those who are listening in. I am a white female with brown and purple hair, wearing glasses and white earbuds, with a brown shirt and a black jacket. I will pass introductions on to Sasha, please.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, regardless of where everyone is calling in from or dialing in from. My name is Sasha Thompson. I am the founder and CEO of the Equity Equation, which is a diversity coaching and consulting firm in the Washington, D.C. area. My pronouns are she, her. I am dialing in from the land that was formerly owned by the Pamunkey tribe in Maryland. And so want to honor them right now as we do this. Physical description, goodness, I didn't even think about that. Black woman with glasses, a little bit of a twisted mouth right now because I'm recovering from dental surgery, orange shirt, and and white earbuds. So thank you for having me.
Maddie, do you mind kicking us off next?
Yes. My name is Maddie. You may know me as the blue-haired unicorn. I typically dial in from Texas, but today I'm dialing in from Rhode Island, which is home to the Narragansett Indigenous tribe. I am local to New England originally, and I'd love to tell people that I am not actually a Texan. For a visual description, I am a Black woman with blue hair and glasses that are exactly the same color, and I am wearing a yellow sweater. And if you've seen me talk before, I was also probably wearing this sweater then.
Thanks so much. Farrel.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Farrel Bolding. He, him, his. I guess I'm an HR person, but I'm probably the most un-HR person you'll ever meet. Because I do my work through a lens of equity, inclusion, and anti-racism, which pretty much puts me at odds with 90% of the HR industry. I'm coming to you all live today from Portland, Oregon, and my home resides on the land of the Cowlitz tribe. Let's see. Description of myself, Black male, Black cisgender male, Afro, small Afro at this point. Need to get a cut. Brown t-shirt, and I'm glad to be here with y'all chatting today.
Thank you so much. Jared.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, everyone. Jared Carroll here, he, him pronouns, calling in from Oakland, California, on Ohlone land. And I just published a book that came out today called A White Guy Confronting Racism. And it just so happens that one of our panelists here, Maddie, wrote the foreword. So you can find that. I do, most of my work is speaking and facilitating conversations and coaching white people, how to evolve their consciousness, how to show up and step up more for people of color and be more relevant and impactful in the anti-racism struggle. Image, I'm a white male. I'm wearing glasses. I have a light beard that maybe you can see, but maybe not. That's, no comments there. And I'm wearing black Beats headphones and a gray hoodie with white kind of tassels here.
Thanks so much, everyone. I really appreciate y'all being here, and we are going to dive into some great topics for these critical conversations. I'd love to kick us off with a bit of a description. How do you all, as practitioners, for example, if you walk into a client for the very first time, how do you define what DEI work actually is? How do you describe that to them? Sasha, I'd love for you to kick us off if you don't mind.
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting question, because that's probably the first question I asked the client, just to level set, right? So oftentimes diversity is kind of what you see, right? It's who we are, how we show up. Inclusion is kind of tied to belonging, and do you feel like you are a part of the organization? Equity is often left out of the equation, hence the name of my business, right? The equity equation. And how do you either provide support or remove barriers so that everyone has equal access, right? So equity and equality are often misconstrued as the same thing. And so we have to do a deep dive into that. But that's kind of how I approach this work, right? Is how do we ensure that the voices of the most marginalized are heard, valued, and seen as you are building out your DEI efforts?
Thank you so much, Sasha, for centering equity, key to this work. Maddie, Farrel, would you like to add anything to that?
So I typically start with my clients, one, asking them the same question, but I start a different way, which is, let's talk about what this work is not. Too often people want this to be a Band-Aid on a much larger problem. And oftentimes they think we're just going to check some boxes and we're going to impress our marketing team and we're going to impress our board and our investors. And if that's the work you're looking to do, I'm not the right practitioner for you. So much of this work is about making sure that marginalized people's voices are actually heard, not that we just slap them on our website and we're like, look, we got Black people on our career page. That's not what we're doing. And so oftentimes people think that is what we're doing. We're going to have like a little 101 conversation and we'll see you in a year and we'll do it again. And so I spend a lot of time talking about what it actually means to do this work. And that means actually doing some really hard work and not just talking about, well, what's the ROI on this? Because sometimes there isn't just a financial ROI on doing the right thing and being a good person. And so I often have to peel back the layers on, we're not doing this for business case reasons. We're doing this for human safety reasons.
Yeah, and I would add to that, one, all of the above, everything that's been said, pure and simple. But that's the thing. It's the humanity in this.
Mm-hmm.
Far too often, when organizations want to do this work, they want to do the work, but they don't want to do the work. And that's why you have to be clear right off the bat. This is the hard work, and this will not be done in like 6 months, 12 months. There's not 3 things I can tell you and then racism solved, because if it was that easy, we wouldn't be having these conversations right now.
Oh, we'd be millionaires.
Exactly. Like, it's weird enough that this is an industry. Mm-hmm. You know, like when you think about all the implications, the hundreds of years of oppression and pain, it's weird enough that this is the industry. So if you're asking people of color, people of culture to come in and do this work, you have to be real honest on how human you're willing to be. Because at the end of the day, this is about human beings. We have to get away from the ROIs. We have to get away from what do the numbers look like. We have to get away from putting people on a pamphlet, putting them on the website. You know, as one of the lone Black people in HR in Portland, like, I know when people are trying to hire me, just so they have that optic, and I know that other people of color know that too. Like, and part of the human thing for me is we need to talk about what we've done in the past, what we're still perpetuating, and how we dismantle those things. Because that's where the equity lies too. We have to be honest about the past and not sitting and dwelling and be in a pity party mode. But we need to take what we know we've contributed to in the past and look at how it's still impacting the present, so we can start unraveling what the future looks like. And that's hard, ugly work.
Thank you so much. Jared, what would you add?
Gosh, I don't know what else I would add. So much wisdom there. I'm glad, Farrel, you centered humanity, because that's at the center of my work. And I take, since I work mostly with white people, to help them understand what they have chosen not to understand because of privilege, because of complacency, right? Because of status quo, all the things, is really, yes, equity, like Sasha said, yes, humanity. And I know Maddie, centers humanity as well. That's why, that's why I appreciate her so much. This balance of there has to be a foundational understanding of social justice principles around power, around equity, of course, around privilege, that we are not, have never, and are not now living in a meritocracy. And so when I come in and I'm working with white people, whether it's one-on-one or in a group, small group, it's really setting those kind of foundational principles and I guess boundaries, you could say, so that when we start to really have deeper conversations, we're coming from that. Because as Sasha said, sometimes equity and equality are conflated or kind of seen as the same thing. I think people think, well, yeah, okay, humanity, I got that. We're all human. So we're just all starting at the same place. Let's just treat everyone nice. It's like, no, you have to understand where everyone is starting from, because niceness doesn't cut it. And so I'm actually increasingly not kind of identifying as a DEI practitioner. Just, I don't know, it feels kind of limiting in a sense. As Farrel said, I understand that, there is an industry, and it is interesting that there is an industry. So it's a little bit of a game kind of to play just from a business perspective. But I think taking it away from that can really actually have us delve into deeper, more impactful, more meaningful conversations.
I get that. I actually refer to myself typically as a people practitioner, because like Farrel, I'm in the HR space. And so I treat my same role. I'm a VP of people for an e-commerce business. I take this same lens into all of the work I do, because HR for so long has had this bad rap of we're here to protect the business. And that's just never been me. We have a legal team. They do their thing. However, my job is to inherently protect the people. And so for me, I very much view everything I do through a people lens. And so I typically say I'm a people practitioner, because I actually hate the word or words HR.
Yeah, I would co-sign that completely. I literally dropped the word diversity from my vocabulary. Like, that word is ODLer at this point. It needs to be taken out back. Maybe we need a new word for it, because that word has been so destroyed and trucked through the mud and made into 15 other things it never was supposed to be. And on the HR side of things, yeah, it's, if you understand the history of HR, that this field was built to stop unions from existing.
Yeah.
It was never meant to help people. So when you're an HR person who wants to help people, it's like companies can't compute the logic involved in that. But it's human resources. The word human is literally in the title. Like, we have to incorporate a stronger lens into the way we talk about how we support human beings.
And see them less as resources.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Now, providing them with resources and access, that should be my job.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
I think I got it wrong this whole time.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a whole conversation in itself.
So I'd love to pull on that thread, if you don't mind. Maddie, Jared said something a moment ago about basing his work in social justice and racial justice. And it made me think of resources that we can provide organizations, like access to tools and frameworks and things like that. Can you all speak on that a little bit? I know, Jared, you have a specific model that you approach your work with. So I'd love to be able to tell those listening a little bit about how you bring those models and frameworks to organizations.
Yeah, would you like me to go first? I wanted
either one.
Oh, sure. So I'll go. So I center four lenses that I've found just as kind of high level lenses that frame conversations. One is social justice, right? Power, equity, privilege, historical inequity, etc. So making sure as best I can that people, even if they're not up to speed on everything, that they understand that this isn't something that just kind of happened when George Floyd was murdered, right? So there's that. The second lens is the EQ, the emotional intelligence, right? How do we bring our self-awareness? How do we navigate conversations that are uncomfortable? How do we lead with empathy and curiosity, vulnerability, right? The third lens is mindfulness. I think that's an underappreciated lens to bring to this work, especially for white people who are kind of like not used to being in these conversations, and we center our discomfort, but there are levels of discomfort. So my discomfort because I don't know what to say, or because this is weird, or because whatever, isn't the same as someone else's discomfort because they're physically afraid for their safety or psychological safety. So that mindfulness of being able to sit with that uncertainty and push through it. And then the fourth thing is storytelling. I think it's another underappreciated lens, individually and collectively. How do we understand our own story and how it interacts and interrelates with other people? How do we recognize whether we are perpetuating or disrupting the status quo, the narrative of the privileged majority, right? So these types of things, and these are kind of buckets, if you will, of frameworks that when I'm working with people, kind of we go deep into all these, and they're reference points when we're having different points, different types of conversations. And it's all an invitation to do further work beyond the sessions or the time that I'm spending with people. Because if it's just me or any one of us really that comes in, like, that's great. Yeah, we're consultants. We come in, we help you, we give you frameworks, but then you got to keep doing the work beyond us.
Great, thank you. Maddie, what would you add to that?
So for me, so much of what I do begins with that uncomfortable self-work. I basically base all of my coursework and workshops through education, tough empathy, and reality. So often we don't get into the reality of what this work means because it makes people uncomfortable. And I've had many conversations where someone has asked me to come into a company and make sure that white men feel safe. And that's not my job. And so often we center this work around whiteness and white comfort. And when I do that, I actually just center whiteness, which is inherently the opposite of this work. So for me, I spend a lot of time doing the self work because, like Jared said, I can come in and I can give you a framework and I can give you strategy. But if you don't do the self work, the stuff that you have to do and sit with by yourself, the hard stuff, then my framework doesn't matter. My strategy doesn't matter. We're just, again, putting a Band-Aid and never solving the problem. But unfortunately, oftentimes that's what people are asking for. They want to be able to say, like, well, Madison Butler came in, or Jared came in, or Farrel came in. And so obviously we fixed whatever was going on. But that's never actually the case. So for me, I just base all of this around having the real conversations around the danger of not doing this work, because people's lives are actually on the line.
Can I piggyback on that? And I think, you know, that's one of the reasons why I do a lot of work around psychological safety. And I have an assessment that I do. And what I love about the assessment is it gives the leader a score. Now, like, it doesn't put the onus on the employees. Like, you as the leader, how psychologically safe does your team feel? And I give them an assessment, and they're really shocked when those numbers aren't what they thought that they would be. And the feedback is saying, like, we're not having a great experience here, right? So then that gives me kind of a starting point to say, okay, this isn't the inclusion that y'all are talking about is not what's being felt. So how do we then work from there? So that's kind of one area that I really do a lot of work in, and do it over time, right? So I'm like, every 6 months we're doing this assessment. So it's not a one and done. It's where were you at the beginning, 6 months from now, and then 6 months from that, right? So you can see progress, right? Or if you're not doing anything, okay, y'all are really not taking this seriously, right? And then that goes up to leadership. And so there's a level of accountability that's kind of built into that process that a lot of companies that I'm working with appreciate, especially the most marginalized voices, because they can be heard and not be held accountable to being put in danger, right? So that's one. The second thing I have found, and I'm hearing a little bit of an echo, so I'm not sure where that's coming from. The second thing that I have found is there's been, and Madison talked about it, right? This quick fix that people have kind of come in. Yep, we want to do this. We want to do this. Oh, we want to have unconscious bias training. I have come to realize that people don't even have the foundational stuff done. So I have a series of workshops that I do with just the foundations. Like, what is diversity? What is equity? What is inclusion? What are identities? Let's talk about generational diversity. Let's talk about microaggressions, right? So we do this foundational work. So at least we have the same vocabulary, right? We understand what we were talking about, because what I've come to realize is people aren't necessarily against what's happening. They just don't understand what is happening. And rather than sign up to say, yes, I want to do that, they're afraid to ask, let's dive deeper. And so that's what we spend a lot of that time doing, is that, okay, let's do this deep dive on identities. If you've never heard of the term cisgender, let's talk about that, right? Let's talk about what non-binary means. Let's talk about, or do you use the term Black or African American, right? And what makes the most sense? Because those are the questions that people have in their heads, but are afraid to say in a corporate or in a work environment. So that's kind of the other area. The third area I focus on is empowerment. And it's really more for those that are underrepresented and not being afraid to have a voice. And I have a whole plans model that I've developed around that. And what that really is like, what is your purpose? What are your limitations? What actions are you going to take to mitigate those limitations? Who's in your network? Because the one thing that I feel that I'm finding is people feel like they're alone in this. They don't have anyone to talk to. And I'm like, no, you have a network. Who is in that network? And it's not always just the folks that you work with, right? What is your strategy? And then the bonus is like self-care, because that's an area that people, especially practitioners, don't think about. So I do a lot of work around self-care for practitioners. And I think that those are some of the foundations that, at least for me, that have made this work feel less like work and feel like a value add to the industry.
I do think the other thing that is important is when I come in is that we're not going to just do like a one equation fits all. Like we can't do this and say that your HR team needs to think about this the same way your engineering team needs to think about this, same way your marketing team needs to think about this. Too often people want to come in and think that, okay, this is just for hiring. How do we hire Black people? How do we hire queer people? And it's not. It's about how accessible is your product? How have you baked bias into your algorithms? How does your marketing team represent externally? It is all of these things, and people think it's just about how we hire people. And that's like the most minor piece of it most of the time.
And that kind of speaks to the Great Resignation, right? Because you could hire them, but if they're going out the back door just as fast, then your efforts don't mean anything. That's not what I was going to say, but yeah, they don't mean anything.
And if you hire a bunch of people who aren't protected and you don't know how to serve them or how to promote them or how to do anything with them, have you actually done anyone a service? Or have you just like inflicted more trauma in the like cycle of trauma that exists in corporate America?
Exactly.
Jared, Farrel, I see y'all muting and unmuting, and I know we're dealing with the echo here.
I'm just co-signing stuff as people saying it, like I'm 100% on board. I have nothing to add.
Yeah, I'm with Farrel. I'm good for now.
Absolutely. Well, we'll add one more piece, because Madison did touch on it. I'm probably unique in that I did not come from, and I think Jared's background is similar too, didn't come from HR, right? So I worked in a corporate space doing diversity work. I was actually in marketing, but I had more experience in diversity and inclusion. I've been doing this for 20 years, right, than a lot of our HR folks. And so what ended up happening was there was a conflict, because there was this mindset, oh, HR is responsible for this. This shouldn't, all of this needs to come out of HR. And I'm like, well, you can't tell me anything, because if you are doing the very things that you're saying that you shouldn't be doing, right, then there's a problem. And so kind of to Madison's point, you have to think about this from each business unit. Like this is something that should be baked across the DNA of the organization and not the responsibility of HR, especially if HR is not equipped to have these conversations, right? Because if you are gaslighting your employees that are coming to you with problems, then you ultimately are the problem.
And historically, HR has been the gatekeeper of all of this, all of the racism, yes, all of the trauma. HR has just been like, oh, you're having a problem. Let me sleep that under the rug and we're going to fire you. Actually, you want me to solve that? I'm going to fire you. So for me, so often HR shouldn't be having these conversations, because HR is then trying to fix their own mess, which we all know people aren't willing to do. Because for HR to come forward and say, oh, I have been the gatekeeper and the perpetrator and the person causing harm, then they have to now have that conversation with themselves. And more often than not, no one is ready to have that conversation.
The Audre Lorde quote, the master's keys whenever, yeah, that one.
Dismantle the master's house.
Yes. Yeah. And I use that all the time.
A place for it. Yeah. It just isn't. Like, and I say this as a person who has no issue with being known as an HR practitioner. Like, it's not the home for it. The amount of HR people that I've worked with in my career who are just a mess, who haven't even got on the game. Like they want to be on stage 5 and they haven't even gotten to stage 0 with any of this. They haven't done their own self-work. They're not engaging in their own self-work. It can't be the home for it, because HR needs to be doing the same work that every other division is doing as well, and looking at themselves and addressing the issues that they're a part of, because HR tends to be at the core of a lot of things that HR doesn't like to talk about.
I see it all the time. They all end up like showing up and showing out on my LinkedIn page. And it's always, for me, disheartening as someone who shares an industry with them to see HR professionals say, well, talking about this is racist against white men, or people don't deserve psychological safety. This is just work. It's like, it makes me want to just like go outside in my yard and scream.
Yeah, I'm almost done with the book right now. I'll probably finish it tonight. Just Mercy Bryan Stevenson's book. I know it was made into a movie as well. And it's interesting, Sasha, you brought up the term gaslighting, right? Like, basically making people, like not believing what they're saying. And so if you've read the book or if you've seen the movie, I'm assuming the movie is follows from the book. The power of his story and the clients on death row and others who he's working with is that he unapologetically believes in their innocence. So that's in the legal case, but bring it into the corporation. Like, I think the problem is, and you've all been kind of touching on it, is, again, we think there's this meritocracy. And so if a black person, says something that, they're experiencing racism, or they experience race or microaggression, or they didn't, whatever, there's this, like, the instinct isn't to just believe them. The instinct is to doubt them. And that is the problem, whether it's in HR or anywhere. Like, I sometimes tell, people like, well, what can I do? What can I start doing to be better? Other white people, like, believe people when they tell you what happened to them. That's a great place to start. And I think, how do you teach that? I mean, I think that's, goes back to humanity. Like we've been talking about at the beginning, right? Believe people, even if, especially if you don't understand it, or it hasn't happened to you, or you're not familiar with it, right? You have to believe people as a starting place. And then you can actually do whatever you need to do, process-wise, procedures, investigation, blah, blah, blah. But if you don't start with like believing people, then it's a non-starter. It's never going to go anywhere, and it's just going to preserve the status quo.
I would say it even has to go back a step further, because in order to start believing people, you have to be comfortable unseating your place of power, because you have to realize that this life that you thought was a meritocracy was actually just praising mediocrity in the name of whiteness. And so you have to be comfortable knowing that, like, I am in this place because of my privilege. And that's how I got here. It's not because I'm smarter, better, faster, stronger. It's because society has uplifted mediocrity for so long and disguised it as meritocracy. And so I think you have to get really comfortable with that before we even start believing people, which I think is why people are so quick to say, no, like racism doesn't exist. Because if I say it exists, that means I have to own up to the harm that I've caused. And at the end of the day, most people at the core of themselves want to be good people. And so to say I've caused harm and admit I've caused harm is actually very hard. So instead they go on the defensive. That's why they don't believe us, because if they believe us, then they have to have a lot of conversation internally about where they've upheld white supremacy and caused harm to other people unintentionally.
And that right there is exactly why part of my work with folks is we have to talk about the good, bad binary. We got to talk about it. Whether you want to talk about it or not, we got to talk about it, because that's where so many people are stuck. It's like, well, you just said something that makes me wonder, am I racist? Oh, I can't be racist. I'm a good person. Like, no, there's no way. That connection between good and righteous and white is so real, and it's so hard for people to get through and to disconnect from. Because owning up to the fact that maybe your whiteness and your goodness aren't the same thing is a really hard thing for a lot of white folks. And I would even throw it out there for people of color who have had a great deal of white power and privilege, or adjacency to, because when you're a person of color, you ain't really got no white power or privilege. So adjacency to it. Like I was doing a training a year ago, and there was a gentleman in the training, and he was Chinese American. But he was adopted at like 2 months by a white couple, and he lived his whole life white. Pretty much, he had a really privileged, really white-centered and focused life. And here he was in his late 50s, now starting to unpack some things, and he realized that he didn't want to know about any aspect of his Chinese heritage or culture. He was more comfortable with the whiteness and the things that the whiteness gave him. So, and this was a person who was in a leadership role in an organization. Like, that connection to this whiteness, this white is right aesthetic, this good, bad thing, is really hard for a lot of people to navigate and get through, because it means you, like you said, you have to ask yourself some really ugly questions that you're not going to like the answers to. And a lot of people can't sit with that, regardless of if they go to therapy, they can't sit with that.
I feel that way, though. I grew up in a very white-centered life with a lot of privilege, and I actually have an article that talks about how I feel like I came out Black at 25, and I was so much more comfortable coming out as queer than saying I was Black. For the longest time, I was like, oh, I'm biracial. Because I grew up in a world where I thought I had to be latched to whiteness in order to be successful, in order to be worthy of a paycheck or love or friendship or whatever it was. I mean, if you saw me 10 years ago, it is like a travesty. My hair was burnt because I straightened it so much. And I swear to you, I had like a light pink polo shirt that said preppy on the collar in rhinestones. Like, it's horrific stuff. And I look back and it's because I latched myself to whiteness because that's what I saw as the model of success. And so often that is our model for success, because when you turn on the TV or you open a book, that is all we see. And it is so hard to even unpack how you can uphold white supremacy as a person of color, as a Black woman, as a queer person, when you're upholding systems that inherently harm you, because in that moment they feel safe.
Yeah.
And so powerful, because I am probably the opposite in that my family is from the Caribbean, right? Mostly Black. And so when my parents moved to the States, they made sure we were in Black communities where all I saw was excellence, right? So grew up next to a college campus with professors. Like, one of my best friends, her dad was a physics professor. So it was nothing for me to be in the physics lab, just playing with experiments. That was just the norm, right? So it wasn't until I got into the corporate space that was challenged, right? Even college a little bit, but even then I was just like in my own little Black excellence bubble, right? In a very, very white school. And so it wasn't until I got into the corporate space that people started to challenge, like, why is she showing up this way? Like, how else am I supposed to show up? Because this is all that I know, right? And I'm going to question authority because that is all I know, right? And so if you're showing up and you're saying, oh, I've never done DEI work, but you're leading diversity and inclusion, I'm going to question your motives. I'm going to question some of the things that you're doing, right? And so it wasn't until I realized that that wasn't my place to do that, and that power dynamic of having to put me in my place, that I realized, like, oh, okay, this is real different. But the flip side of that is, having grown up in Virginia and seeing a lot of different things, I can recognize when that supremacy shows up and how to navigate around it, right? And I think many of us aren't taught necessarily how to navigate around it. We're taught to how to get through it, deal with it,
Yeah.
dive into it, and all of those things. And so that, I think, is a part of this awakening that's happening right now too, is you're starting to see people stand up. I think there's this beautiful illustration of, I guess, this older white men playing chess on the backs of Black and brown people. And it's like, all you have to do is stand up and you'll throw the whole game off, right? And so it's like, how do we start to stand up and empower those that are the most marginalized in this work? And so that's, I think, what is really critical as we continue to move forward.
So y'all are hitting on all of the major barriers in organizations, in the me work and the we work, right? All of us. Unpacking white supremacy and structures and systems in and ourselves, dealing with the construct of whiteness. How do we center equity without further marginalizing and stigmatizing folks? I mean, this is deep work. So I'd love to spend some time hearing from you all about how you help organizations move forward in this challenging work. What are you seeing folks struggle with the most? What do you see them getting stuck with? And then how do you help them get past some of these really pervasive, long-standing, and difficult barriers?
I think one of the things I deal with a lot is the fear of messing up. And that's very much on the individual level. And knowing that you could mess up then keeps people from wanting to do the work, because there's a lot of shame that comes with messing up publicly or just feeling like you did something wrong. And we all get that, whether it's at work or the first time you play a new sport or like the first time I got on a spin bike. It didn't feel good. And I think there's this idea that at one point you're just done doing this work. You're done learning. You're done having these internal conversations. And that feels very daunting to feel so far away from that light at the end of the tunnel. And one of the things I have to consistently tell people is none of us are experts at this work because it's so ever changing and I'm always learning. I can't be an expert if I'm constantly diving in and trying to learn more and do better. And so for me, so much of this work is how do you let your ego show up? Do you let your ego keep you from doing better the next time and saying, you know what, well, screw it. I don't want to do it because I don't want to feel that level of shame again. And I don't want to say I'm sorry. And that's the thing I struggle with the most is when people mess up, wanting to just give up instead of saying, you know what, I'm going to mess up probably every day until the end of time. And it's about how I come back from that. Does my ego let me come back from that? Or do I just take a back seat because it felt yucky to mess up? And so oftentimes that's what I'm sitting with hiring managers and leadership, because once you kind of acknowledge the harm that you've done and how that harm has centered your culture and the organization you have, they don't want to keep feeling that over and over. So at some point they're like, you know, it's good. We're good here. We'll just stop. And that is, for me, the most pervasive thing, because that fear will ruin this work in any organization.
Yeah, Maddie, that's so good. And, you know, the story you shared about kind of coming out as Black and then contrasting that with the story Sasha shared of like, yeah, Black excellence, like why would I think anything else? I think just those two stories on this call right now illustrate like the need to share stories. And it can't just be, you know, the marginalized Black people, and I think white people. So to answer your question, Lynn, like one thing that I do, because I do a lot of individual or small group work, right? Like I'm working with leaders, I'm working with, people managers kind of in small facilitated groups. What are our stories of race and racism? So an example, there's a company I've been doing some work with for quite a while, like 6-8 months, and starting to do some more specific leadership with their CEO and a couple other, and they're like a scientific engineering firm. So you can just imagine they're not the most, the most extroverted and kind of, so it's a challenge. But I've been working with the CEO, and he started telling his story a little bit differently when he comes in at the beginning of these sessions. That's way more personal, that's way more vulnerable, and that helps him see why the work matters to him. And then when he shares that with his team or the group or the cohort or whoever's in the session, they go, oh, well, if he's saying that, okay, like what's my story? And so like my story, Jared's story, I say I wouldn't even exist if we lived in an equitable world. My dad was a gay man, and he married a woman because that's what you did in the early 70s, because you could get killed for being a gay man. You still can, but it was a lot more dangerous back then. So he did what he was supposed to do, and he had a family, and I was the son. Finally he realized that he didn't realize, he knew, but finally he admitted, he had the courage to share that he was gay with the world, and he came out. Parents got divorced. I didn't know till I was 15 almost. My dad tells me he's gay. I'm like, oh my gosh. And talk about ego. Granted, I was, adolescence, but I was worried about me, the shame, the stigma, the embarrassment, right? So I tell this story and so many other stories as a way to model vulnerability, to model the why. And I think, if we can kind of instigate a storytelling culture around this DEI work or anti-racism work or whatever we want to call it, that can be really powerful. And especially the people who have the most power and visibility and influence to start telling their stories can be really transformative.
Yeah, I think the stories are really real. Like sitting in this space right now, and actually, Madison, I recall the article that you talked about. I read it, like it resonated with me deeply because I have friends who have had the same experience. I have chosen family who have had the same kind of coming out story when it comes to their racial identity and their cultural identity. So I appreciate that, and I also appreciate what Shasta shared. And my Black story is completely different. And that's what's so great about that. That's what's so great about the concept of being able to understand your story, because people love to lump people of color into one monolithic shape. Like, this is three different Black experiences here. Jared's had a different experience than Lynn. Like, there are, of course, intersecting concepts, struggles. I mean, we are all living in a white supremacist society, so those things are all gonna pop up in some way, shape, or form. But like, I'm a poor Black kid from Detroit. I didn't have any confidence that I was gonna even be here by the age of 39, let alone be on a panel talking about my life and my experiences. Like, the stories are sometimes very key for helping people, especially for white people who have no connection at times to a cultural identity of any kind other than white, because that's the situation we found ourselves in when they were handing out white passes to people way back when. A lot of folks had to leave their whole culture and ethnicity on the back burner, and they're just white. And there's so many folks who don't have that connection. Now, I will say, I do like to draw the line and making sure people aren't trying to tell us their supervillain origin story. Like, I don't need to know why you're racist or sexist or homophobic. Just deal with it and stop doing it all the time. Like, I don't need to know the history. I don't need to know that you almost got robbed by a Black kid. And, when you were 13, and here you are at 62, and that's why you're racist. Like, no, you had 40 some odd years to work on that. We're not going to let that be your origin story. So there are lines for the stories. As far as things that I think stop progress, I have to go back to what's already been said, where I think that there's so much fear in failing. But there's also a fear of accountability. Like, having to own up to, yeah, I let my uncle come to my house every Thanksgiving, which is a whole messed up situation unto itself. We ain't gonna get into Thanksgiving today. I have my family over for the holidays, and they say horrible things. And I just let Uncle Bob say horrible things because that's the way it's supposed to be. Like, my wife is white, and the first Christmas I spent with her family, I'm the only person of color there. I'm probably the only Black person any of them have ever talked to really for any length of time in their lives. And I'm sitting at the end of the table, and they are having a full-on conversation about how the Blacks and the Colombians are bringing the drugs into the country and the crime. Now, I'm just sitting at the end of the table. Like, you just met me. And this is the cut. So I went and sat in the car. I was like, I'm done. I don't even want to eat. And I have not gone to a Christmas since. And I had this horrible conversation with my mother-in-law about it after the fact. And it's taken her almost 15 years to get it. But the only reason she got it is because there's a Black person married to her daughter. Like, those are the things where people don't want to really sit and listen to, wow, I was a part of that. I let that happen. That I consider that a regular Tuesday when Bob comes in the office and says that. I consider that was part of my childhood growing up. My cousins, my uncle, my dad said all sorts of horrible things all the time. Like, those are the deep unpacking that people have to be willing to do that makes this ugly. And then just when people want to bail, because now we started touching on things they don't want to talk about. No one wants to confront their family about these things. No one wants to talk with their siblings about these things, because that means you might get extricated from whiteness. And no one wants to get excommunicated from whiteness because that's the in crowd. That's where the safety is. So that's really hard for a lot of people, getting past also that fear of accountability.
And I think that even exists as a Black person, as a person of color. And I learned it pretty hard last year during the election, was like, oh my God, all of these people are racist, but they just liked me. And having to sit with that was incredibly hard, whether it was my Blackness or my queerness or like they're just a misogynist. They made me the exception to the rule. And it was really hard to sit and unpack that and draw that boundary and separate myself from people who I've known my entire life, family or not. And I think we all come to this point where you're like, now what? What does that boundary look like? And how do you cross it, especially when it involves family ties and partners and things like that? It is hard. And like, there's no better way to say it, but it sucks.
And you have to be okay with that. And I think that's the piece that's the human side of all of this, right? Though this is our profession, this is very personal, right, as well too. And so it's the storytelling, I think, is important, but I agree with Farrel, is like there you have to draw a line, because I've had to come to the realization that I don't want to provide pain porn, right? Like I don't want to continue to tell my story and put myself in a position where I'm crying or I'm having to share so much just so you can get it, right? Like that's not what this is about. And so how do you find that balance where people do the work themselves? And for a long time, that was my hashtag, right? Like do the work, do the work. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but you need to do the work and you need to figure that out. Google is free. That was another hashtag that I like to use, right? Google is free. You don't have to come ask your Black or brown or gay or whatever friend, right? You can do the research yourself. And the other piece that kind of came up for me too, going back, Lynn, to your question, was I think companies need to get past or realize that what's happening right now is past the checkbox, right? Like that is no longer acceptable. And so what they need to do is, and this is coming from someone that's in marketing, stop listening to your marketing, PR, and legal teams. Like stop, because they're just doing 1980s compliance just to do the bare minimum to get by, versus what's the most that we can do in order before we get sued for doing the most, right? Like, how do we look at this in a way where we flip it on its head? And so many companies, because they're being led by fear, they're running to legal, they're running to HR, to these teams that haven't done any of this work. And so again, it's stuck in this 1980s, 1970s mindset of compliance, of affirmative action. We're past that. 21st century work in this space looks very different, and they have to be prepared for that. And that's what we're talking about here. And many of these companies aren't ready for that because they're still trying to figure out, how do we get this checkbox done and move on.
I really appreciate you all touching on all the critical conversations today. I think that we have definitely spanned the breadth and depth of doing this work. We only have a few minutes left, and I really invite everyone who's watching and listening today, y'all follow these influencers, follow these practitioners. They have some amazing work on their own media feeds and their own media streams so that everyone can continue learning every day beyond just this one listening session. So as we close, the one really important topic we didn't touch on is accountability. And in a minute or less, what do you all have to say about how organizations can be more accountable to doing this work?
I'll just throw out, I think it needs to be tied to performance plans for leadership, right? If it's tied to your compensation, all of a sudden it becomes really important. And so it's just a matter of how do you do that in a way that is that still reflects the company, but there's a level of accountability in there. Like if you're not going to get your bonus unless you've done these 5 to 10 things.
So accountability for me means please stop writing no tolerance policies in your handbook and then not like acting on them, because then you actually just protect your abusers. I don't care if Joe Bob is a high performer or Sandy Sue is the CFO. If you have people who are causing harm, deal with it, even when they make you money.
Yeah. And on top of that, be willing to let those harmful people go.
Yes.
Way too often we end up in these situations where we want to, the question is always, how do we get the people who don't want to do this to do this? You give them knowledge, you give them tools. They choose, they still don't want to do it. There's a door over there, and I can help you get your resume ready to go right out the door and go somewhere else. We don't have to keep the toxic people. Like, we don't have to keep the harmful folks in our space. I've worked for way too many companies where folks have been there 20 years and have a file the size of a Bible on things they've said and done to people that have just been written up and put in a file. How are you still there at 20 years? You've been harming people then for like 15, 20 years. It's okay for them people to go. If we're really trying to make our company, our organization, that much better, it is okay that when we start doing the deep dive work, If those people don't like it, they can go.
And I would say even when you're interviewing, be accountable to those values. People deserve to know where you stand from day one, not on day 60 or day 90. If you are actually doing this work, I would recommend that you talk about the fact that you're doing this work in your interview. Let people opt out, because otherwise you're just trying to walk people at day 90 and day 120 when they could have just opted out on day -5.
There we go. I mean, everything Maddie and Sasha and Farrel said, I don't know that I would add much, except that I like what you just said, Maddie, is that I don't know if I think this works toward accountability. Maybe this isn't the accountability. I think everything you've all said is kind of the actual accountability, but to get in that place, talk it, right? If you're a leader, if you're a hiring manager, if you're in a, start saying, like, this is who we are, and then kind of holding yourself and everyone else who's hearing you accountable. And I know talk doesn't make change, but if you are in the right place and you've done a little bit of the work and you're actually thinking about what type of person do I want to be, what legacy do I want to have for this company, for my family, for my career, etc. Like, if you start talking about it, and if you are in integrity, which I know there are a lot of ifs, but I do have hope, right? If you're in integrity and you start talking about it, then that's like who you're going to start to be perceived as, and you can kind of live into that. So that's the only thing I would add to everything else that I 100% agree with that the three of you have said.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and for this beautiful conversation, and for modeling these difficult, courageous, and critical conversations that we have had today. That is our time, and thank you again for everything that you've brought to the Tri-Cities Diversity and Inclusion Summit.
Lynn, thank you so much for moderating this discussion. There were so many amazing nuggets that I took away. Phrases that resonated with me were things like, in the end, it's about human beings. We need to be honest about the past and how it still impacts the present. Disrupting the status quo. Foundational work has to be done first. There's the me work and the we work. And the accountability of I let that happen. Man, so many amazing things. Thank you, Farrel, Madison, Sasha, and Jared for sharing your expertise and experiences. Oh man, we really appreciate your contribution to the conversation today. Fantastic job. And that's a wrap for the first day of the 2021 Tri-Cities Diversity Summit. Do not miss tomorrow's listening sessions. DEI Toolkit Workshop begins at 10 a.m. sharp. Our presenter will review a toolkit example and provide suggestions on how organizations can create a toolkit and implement the practices described. At 11:15 tomorrow, we'll be joined by prominent local leaders during the CEO Roundtable listening session. So hear how leaders of Greater Columbia Accountable Community of Health, HAPO Community Credit Union, New Edge, and Carbotex use effective DEI practices in their organizations. Register for both sessions at the link in the Zoom chat. The Tri-Cities Diversity Summit keynote presentation will be held this Wednesday at noon. Keynote speaker Kuma Roberts will give you 5 quick wins to supercharge your business strategy for inclusion. Kuma is a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant with over 10 years of organizational development experience, specializing in the business case for DEI, cultural competence, implicit bias, and more. And also, we will honor the recipients of the 2021 Tri-Cities Champion of Diversity Awards. You are not going to want to miss it. So go ahead and register right now at the link in the chat. And all sessions from the Tri-Cities Diversity Summit will be posted on the Chamber's YouTube channel, Facebook page, and on tricityregionalchamber.com. We're also going to email the links out to all of today's attendees, and feel free to share these videos with your friends, family, and colleagues. I think it's a great way to start the dialogue by sharing this information in these great panel discussions. Thank you to all the sponsors of this year's Tri-Cities Diversity Summit. Our premier sponsor being Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Our gold sponsors, Greater Columbia Accountable Community of Health and HAPO Community Credit Union. Our silver sponsors, Christensen Inc., Columbia Basin College, Energy Northwest, HPM Corporation, and Cadillac. Our bronze sponsors, Bechtel National Inc., BNSF Railway, Carbitex, Redder and Company, Sotheby's International Realty, and Washington State University Tri-Cities. Thank you so much for joining us today. What a powerful discussion. I hope you'll be back tomorrow for day 2 of the Tri-Cities Diversity Summit. Thank you so much and take care.